What are they doing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing. And where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Today we have a very special guest on the Mindful Cranks, Brian Victoria, who is the author of Zen at War, as well as many academic papers. We're talking to him tonight from Kyoto, right, Brian?
That's correct.
Well, welcome. And
thank you.
We also have David Forbes in Brooklyn.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we thought we would dive in a little bit to what you've been working on. But before we do that, I think our listeners would like to know a little bit about yourself and how did you gravitate towards Zen Buddhism, and then we'll ask you what led you to write the book Zen at War. So what was your journey into Zen Buddhism?
All right. Step number one. I became, after I did a junior year abroad program in Denmark in 1959-60, I became, it's a long story, we'll abbreviate that here, but at least I came back and became registered for the draft as a conscientious objector.
Oh, wow.
And once you do that, you have to do, at that time, this was before, of course, the war in Vietnam. This was not connected to any particular war. Although by that time, I already realized that America, I don't know if you folks are aware of it, but since America was founded in 1776, our country has been at war 91% of its life.
Yes.
So
terrible.
I knew that we'd be back at it again. And so although I was not objecting to any particular war, I was objecting to the idea that my government was going to order me to kill people that I had never met for reasons that I may or may not agree with. So I became a conscious objector. I had to do alternate service duty, and I was at a Methodist school, Nebraska Wesleyan University, and I saw on the bulletin board one day that it was possible to become a short-term missionary for the Methodist Church, and that would be counted as alternate service duty. So I signed up for that, and it's another long story. I was originally to go to Hong Kong, but they couldn't send me there, and I was to go to Taiwan. They couldn't send me there, and finally they said, well, we could send you to Japan. And I really didn't want to go to Japan because I had heard these stories about the geisha girls from my older friends on the block in Omaha, Nebraska, where I was born. And I looked at those dragons on their backs of their coats with Okinawa 1951 to 53, etc. And I thought these Japanese have the worst artistic quality. And little did I know that it was the GI's artistic ability and had nothing to do with the Japanese, who have, as we know, excellent artistic ability. But at any rate, so I came to Japan in that fashion. However, we had to do, before, if we were going to save the heathen souls of the Japanese as missionaries, we had to know what the heathen souls were believing. And so one of the first things, we had a 3-month training period before I came to the mission field. And during that time, I read Sir Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia. And that was really the beginning of my interest in Buddhism at the time. And especially my father had died when I was in senior year as an undergraduate. And I was still grieving. During that summer, I was still grieving for his death. At least I thought of myself as grieving. And I thought that my grief was coming from my deep love for my father. But as I read Sir Edwin Arnold's prose description of the Buddha's life, the thing that really moved me was his description of death, and the fact that death was related. Really, when we grieve for the death of someone, we like to imagine, I think this is not true just for myself, but for many people, that their grief is because of their love for, in this case, the dead person, in this case, my father. But as I understood what was written there, in fact, the grief was not for that other person, but it was for my loss. I was grieving for what I had lost. Mm-hmm. And that relieved a great deal. In essence, grief is selfish. It's for oneself, not for the other, even though we imagine it to be for the other. And when I realized I was grieved, that it was my grief came out of my own loss, my own feeling of missing someone who had been very important in my life, that relieved me of a great deal. It made me face that my grief was not for my father, but was for myself. And that helped. That was a great relief and allowed me to pass through and understand the nature of grief, at least for me, better than I had before. All right, so that's step number one. All right. Step number two was after I arrived in Japan. Again, I felt the need, if I was going to save the heathen, I'd better really try to figure out where the heathen are coming from. And so my first Christmas vacation in Japan, I didn't celebrate Christmas as normally. I went into a Zen Buddhist monastery, which happened to be Eiheiji, and which is a Soto Zen monastery. And I hated every day of, and I jumped in head first to a sesshin.
Uh-oh.
And that was the beginning. And my legs hurt, and the monks were yelling at me, and I was doing everything wrong. I thought, this is one of the craziest religions. What in the hell am I doing here?
Did they whack you on the back too?
Oh, absolutely, multiple times. Although in the Soto Zen, as you may know, they only do it. They whack you multiple times, but only once at a time. Unlike the Rinzai folks who do it multiple times each time they whack you. But at any rate, I still wanted to jump up and grab that stick and give them a good whack any number of times. But I restrained myself from doing that. So at any rate, as I left Eiheiji after those 2 weeks, I thought, I will never, ever come back to this crazy place like this again. And so I was really then kind of reinforced. Thank goodness I'm a Christian here and not one of these crazy Buddhists. No wonder we need to convert the heathen soul to these people. But anyway, so here I am back in Tokyo. And probably about 2 or 3 weeks after this experience, I reflected on it a little bit, and suddenly I just slowly drew a breath. And up until that time, we've been David, to concentrate on your breath and to control your breath and all of those things we know about. And I took this deep breath, not a deep breath necessarily, but I became aware of my breath in a way I had never become aware before. I thought breathing, for most of us, that's just something you do. It's just automatic part of it. But when I took this breath, I realized I had a kind of flashback to my time in Eiheiji, but instead of all of the pain in my legs and all of the negativity that I had experienced before, this time it was a very positive experience. And I realized for the first time in my life that breath could be spiritual, and that it could have a spiritual meaning, and that there was a joy in that breath. And so that was really the beginning of my, I will say, renewed interest in Zen as a method of not only controlling or becoming aware of the breath, but finding the joy, the spiritual meaning in the breath. And from that drove me actually back to go again. And this time around, of course, I kind of knew the ropes. Mm-hmm. So I didn't hit as much, and I didn't get yelled at as much. And but that joy of discovering the breath was what led me into Buddhism, but also into Zen. But also that was plus the realization I'd had, the relief I'd felt from the grief of my father's death. So it was a combination of both that emotional part, but us at the same time, as I said, the discovery of the spiritual meaning of the breath.
Uh-huh.
And probably if I were to add one other thing, I have to admit that by that time, my ideas on Christianity were beginning to clarify that God played, that I could not believe in the traditional understanding of God. And I welcomed Buddhism, I really think, too, although I was not quite aware of it at the time, because to me, the great blessing of Buddhism is that it is not an atheistic religion per se, but is certainly not a theist. It is really, I think, the best quality is a non-theistic religion. Mm-hmm. So if God exists or he doesn't exist, that's really not an important issue. It's really not a matter that one, as a Buddhist, needs to worry about, because there are other things, more important things, to worry about than that. And that really also increasingly met my spiritual needs, in which God played such an increasingly minimal role in my life. Mm-hmm. Oh, stop.
And so you were in Japan, and then eventually you went in a scholarly direction, right? Did you go into a Buddhist studies program?
Yes, I did, but it wasn't so much of a scholarly program. I finished my alternate service duty, which is normally 2 years, but in order to be a short-term missionary, you have to agree to do it 3 years. So I finished that, and I continued my training as a layperson at Eiheiji, doing session. They have 2 sessions a year there. So I went there, and I met the discipline master, who's called in Japanese an Ino. I met him, and we became close, and I understood that one should become a disciple of a Zen master. And so I asked him if I could do that, but he didn't speak any English, and my Japanese was very limited. And so I realized that if I was going to become close to him, if I was going to enter and train there as a monk, that I would first need to have far more Japanese than I had. And so I spent, after those 3 years, the first thing I did was to spend 1.5 years in intensive language study. Uh-huh. And at that time, then I entered Eiheiji, and I was there for nearly 2 years. But during that time, I also realized that at that time, everything was not only in Japanese, but it was in Sino-Japanese. And I realized that I could do the basic things I was expected to do, but I really wasn't understanding the significance of them. So that's when I decided that I needed to complement my actual training with not more language study, but also a deeper study of the significance of what I am doing and the religion. And that's when I decided to go to Komazawa University, which is associated with the Soto Zen sect. And I've spent actually 4 years there, acquiring a master's degree in Buddhist studies. So yes, that was the academic side, but the academic side was really dedicated to further understanding and deepening my actual Zen practice.
Huh. Oh, I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm. And so somewhere along the line, you started to think about writing this book, Zen at War. So how did that come about?
Well, I didn't really think about writing the book.
Okay.
And I didn't even really I wasn't the catalyst for what happened. The catalyst for what happened was, of course, the increasing military American U.S. presence in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So it came from the outside in, as it were. And so in the 67, 68 period, why that was when America was engaged in a major escalation of the Vietnam conflict. And the more I tried to be, having been a conscious objector, I must say, I was predisposed, if you will, to look at this next military engagement with some skepticism. Mm-hmm. And so the more I read about the background, and of course, I was also, Vietnam is a Mahayana country, but it's a Buddhist country as well. And so the more I read about that, the more, and the struggle of the Vietnamese Buddhists in that situation, in which, of course, some few even emulated, right, burned themselves to death. That was certainly a catalyst for me to question the relationship. Now I had become formally entered as a neophyte Soto Zen monk, and it caused me to question, well, what is the relationship of Buddhism to war and peace? And so that was the catalyst. And then the fact that I felt that I needed to do something to show my concern about the war. And actually, we started off in 1967 in a very low-key way, and that is we opened, I tried to, our plan was to teach over the summer, to teach English and French, because we had a Frenchman among this small group of foreigners, and we would teach these languages for free, and all of the income we received would be used for medical relief in Vietnam. All right, and I went to a Zen Buddhist temple, a number of them in Tokyo, and asked, would they allow us to use their temple as the site for our summer language school? And they all said no, quickly. And so, to my kind of chagrin, I said, well, the only place we could find that would give us free classrooms was a Methodist, a United Church of Christ, a former Methodist church in Shibuya, in Tokyo. So there I was back among my Methodist friends. But at any rate, then from that summer where we became more active, there was an organization called Beheran, and they were a non-ideological but opposed to the war. So we started cooperating with them, and but at any rate, and went to some demonstrations, etc. And that led me to being called on the carpet by, I was staying at the Tokyo Betsu-in, which is the Tokyo, not the headquarters, but anyway, it was a temple directly under Eiheji's control. And so I remember, Eiheji is the head temple, one of the two head temples of the Soto Zen. A little echo there, I think. But anyway, the quick then is that I was called on the carpet by the head of this Eiheji Betsuin, and he told me that Buddhist priests don't get involved in politics, and that if I didn't stop, all of my actions were legal. They were participation in demonstrations, etc. They were all legal. There was nothing illegal about anything I was doing. But nevertheless, if I didn't stop doing that, I was going to be defrocked, thrown out of the priesthood. All right.
Yeah, I caught that in the preface of the book, and that's what immediately jumped out at me was that Zen priests don't get involved in politics.
That's right. And so at that point, I began. I asked myself, here I am a neophyte priest. Am I getting all of this stuff wrong? Especially, I'd read D.T. Suzuki, and he talked about that Buddhism had never been involved. 2,500 years of history, Buddhism has never been involved in warfare, etc., etc. So I thought, well, maybe I'm really getting this wrong. And so, but it was at that time that just accidentally, as it were, but I started looking around for some kind of understanding of Buddhism's relationship to war. And the first book I came across was a book by a professor who was also a Rinzai priest himself. His name was Ichikawa Hakugen. and he had written a book in Japanese, and I could read it by then, called The War Responsibility of Buddhists. And it was exposing, basically, it was really a book not unlike Zen at War, in which he quoted all of these so-called Zen masters during the wartime era, in which they were, enthusiastic supporters, not only of the war effort, but that they used Buddhism, their understanding of Buddhism, they invoked that to justify their support of Japan's war effort. And so that's when, as it were, the veil was lifted from my eyes. And then I looked again at D.C. Suzuki, his writings again, and I saw something different than I had seen before. And so that was the catalyst then for writing, because I knew that many of my fellow American Buddhists were still under the belief, I consider them I had to say then, by the naive belief that Buddhism was a truly, a religion truly devoted to peace, and was not a religion that had been involved like Christianity or Judaism or Islam in all of holy wars, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's even to this day, that's still a common romantic image of Buddhism.
Yes, it very is.
And
I'm sad to say now, I'm sad to say now, thanks to I think we're going to talk about it later, thanks to people like the Rohingya in Burma that show that this is a rather widespread phenomenon in Buddhism.
Yeah. And
was the book kind of an expose? I mean, it was critical. It wasn't just sort of
That's right. I mean, people as an academic, you're supposed to be objective, right, and not take sides and all of that. But of course, objectivity, I think, is certainly in the eye of the beholder. The minute that you select certain quotations and don't select other quotations, right, you're no longer objective.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the social humanities and social sciences, that's a whole different world.
Therefore, certainly, although on the one hand, I consider that, really, if you look at my book, it's primarily just one quote after another quote, with a little commentary on my end of it. But certainly, I think they're characterizing it as a expose, if you will, of the dark side of Zen. I think is a correct understanding of it.
So in the West or in the U.S., people were reading D.T. Suzuki, but they were reading him in English, his English translations, his English works. So was it the fact that you were able to dig into some of D.T. Suzuki's writings in Japanese that we didn't have access to that led you to come to these revelations?
No, actually, that's not at the time.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Wait a minute here. I got him messed up here. No, it was not at the time, but rather what happened was I began to explore what the effects of his writing had been. All right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he was basically writing the same thing in Japanese that he was writing in English, but I began to see that his description of, you really have to read, first of all, two things. Most of us many people have been introduced to Zen Buddhism in particular by his book, Zen Japanese Culture. All right?
Yes.
But that book is actually a revised version of his original 1938 book, which was Zen and its influence on Japanese culture. I didn't realize that at the beginning. All right? And what I didn't realize either was that his book in 1938, the minute it was published only in Japan in English, So it had a very limited circulation. But immediately after, he did not speak any other language that I know of besides, well, he could read, etc., Sanskrit, blah, blah, but not any modern European languages. At any rate, the first thing that he did, I discovered, after he published his book, was to send copies to German publishers. And his book was picked up by, let's say, the Nazis. And it was published in the first foreign language translation of his book was in 1941 in Germany. And it was welcomed by the Nazis. And the question is, what would the Nazis see in that book that was of such interest to them? So I do have a little quote here from it. Was the main Nazi newspaper was called the Völkischer Beobachter. Unfortunately, I had some German background in my studies as an undergraduate. And so this is what I don't know if you can see this. Probably you can't see this. But anyway, this is what they said when they published this on January 11th of 1942. Was the introduction to the German edition and of this Völkischer Beobachter, the People's Observer, it would mean in English. But it was the main Nazi newspaper. So they published 4 full pages of Suzuki's work.
Wow.
Not on the front page, but on the inside, but just as it was. At any rate, this is in those pages that they published. The words "death," "die," "deadly" occur no less than 14 times in those 4 pages. All right, and typically, what they then went on to describe why this was so important. And this is the commentary they gave. This was on January 15th of 1942. They said, Suzuki is a Zen priest. Of course, he was never a Zen priest.
Right.
He was a late. But Suzuki is a Zen priest and professor at a Buddhist university in Kyoto. The recent decade in particular has once again led the Zen sect to increased importance in Japan. The battle for Japan's survival is taking place against the powerful backdrop of a history that has been able to survive for 2.5 millenniums in a rare concord of race, religion, and politics. It's quite understandable that in this difficult time for the existence of the Japanese people, they would retreat to the intellectual roots of their history and regard them as being quite valid for their present. The outstanding national virtues of the Japanese are anchored in the Zen sect, a fact that signifies a monumental endorsement of this practical life art. I won't read any more, but it goes on to tell, when you read what the Nazis were getting out of his book, and then you go back and read the book, say, wow, the Nazis were not misunderstanding Suzuki. They were quite accurately describing, because what he does in that book, if you read it carefully, you have to read it carefully, talk about the traditional samurai warrior, and then he'll say this is as valid for soldiers today as it was, for Japanese soldiers today as it was then. We have to remember that book was written in 1938, which was Japan had launched its full-scale invasion of China, but had not yet gone to war with the United States. The second thing we have to understand is that it turns out that when you look at Zen after the war, it was reprinted by Princeton University, no less, Princeton University Press, and Suzuki added a new chapter. And in that chapter, it talks about Zen and compassion, Buddhist compassion, and it doesn't get involved. It doesn't do war, and the warriors were there. They were really spiritual people, blah blah blah. But that was added after. So when you look at the original book, you really realize this was a book. And then when you you understand that book, and then you look at Suzuki's writings for the Japanese military.
Mm.
He was writing the same things for the officer corps. That Zen requires you, once you've chosen the path, you go forward on the path. You don't look to the left, you to the right. You don't think about it. You just do it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how he was encouraging the officers to act during the war. Because Zen, it's very important to recognize, Zen was a practice for the officers. It was not a practice and it had never, Zen has always been an elite practice in Japan. It's been a practice for the samurai who were an elite. If you ask, well, where was the Buddhism for the ordinary people? That was in the Pure Land sect.
Mm-hmm.
The Shin sect, as it's known in Japan. And in that Pure Land sect, what did they say? You repeat the name of the Buddha, Namu Amida Butsu, I take refuge in Amida Buddha. You repeat that as you are charging the machine gun nest, firm in the belief that if you are killed, you will be reborn in the Pure Land. So Buddhism is very stratified, as I discovered, and but each group of Japanese soldiers had its own form of Buddhism to justify its participation in the war. And that was, of course, when I reread the book, and with a Nazi mindset, it all jumped out at me. Thank you.
And there's one point in the book that really stood out for me too, was because it was very instrumental in introducing Buddhism to the West, was the World Parliament of Religion meeting in Chicago when Shaku Soen?
Yes, that's right.
He was the emissary who,
and he by the way was D.T. Suzuki's master.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And it was he who authenticated D.T. Suzuki's first awakening or enlightenment experience, or his Satori experience. Please go ahead, though.
No, and so from what I remember in the book is that D.T. Suzuki tried to present the Mahayana in a very different light than people had understood up to that point. Would you say could you say a little bit about what happened there?
Well, we have to go back and understand that when, I mentioned Sir Edwin Arnold, and Buddhism was introduced to the West not by D.T. Suzuki. Buddhism was introduced to the West by first British and then German scholars who were working with Indian material, particularly Theravada materials.
Yeah, the early canon. Mm-hmm.
That's the early canon.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, they themselves had their own, we can call it prejudice, and that is that the early canon was the true Buddhism, and that Mahayana was a later upstart. And not only was an upstart, but it had debased the original Buddhism, and they had all of these multiple magical figures, etc. And so Buddhism, that Mahayana was not only the stepside, but stepchild, but almost the bastardized stepchild of the true, authentic, original Buddhism, which was today expressed in the Theravada tradition. So Suzuki was was certainly aware of that. And so one of the things that they were trying to do, beginning with the Chicago Exposition, is to say, look, that Mahayana is an authentic expression of Buddhism, and that not only that, but of that authentic expression, the essence of Mahayana is in the Zen tradition. Uh-huh. And so it was his attempt then to give to establish Mahayana, but in particular to establish Zen as a bona fide, as an authentic form of Buddhism.
Right, and That was in
And
1893. That 1893.
Yes, let me add too, that there was a built-in, there was also a built-in criticism of the Theravada tradition in that it was not socially active. Right. And that this was great, that Buddhism in Japan in particular was very much a part of having animated Japanese history. In particular, animated the warriors. Mm-hmm. And even them, otherwise they would have been brute force. But thanks to the fact that they had been encountered Buddhism, but particularly Zen Buddhism, they had become spiritual warriors and not simply brute soldiers. Uh-huh. And so the idea then was that Mahayana, in a certain sense, was not only an authentic form of Buddhism, but it was the most genuine form because it was socially engaged. They didn't use the word socially engaged in the time, but that was the meaning, that it had been very actively involved in forming, in particular, Japanese culture in a very positive way.
And so, in your book, you state that you really wanted to focus on this period from 1868 to 1945. Yeah. Why is that? What was that? That was a conscious decision on your part.
Yes, it certainly was. Because number one, we can't in one book you can't do it all.
Right.
But number two, it was of greatest interest because World War II was still very much a part of everyone's psyche at the time. But the other thing I realized too, and here's a certain extent I became, if you will, a little bit sympathetic to what happened to Japanese Buddhism. And what happened to Japanese Buddhism, of course, was that 1868 comes along. Basically, Shinto and Buddhism had been effectively for over 1,000 years, they had been one religion. But in 1868, the government said we need to have a spiritual basis to unite the people around a modern form of nationalism. Mm-hmm. Now, Buddhism had become so intertwined with the Tokugawa feudal authority, plus the fact that it was a quote unquote foreign religion. It had been in Japan at that point for over 1,000 years, but it was still a foreign religion, and therefore they wanted to have an authentic Japanese religion as the basis of their modern nationalism. And they therefore split the two religions physically, very physically split. They took the Buddhist statues out of the shrines, etc., and split the two, and then financially supported Shinto. Now, what this did to Buddhism, it made Buddhism, for the first time in its long history, 1,000-year plus history, it was cut off from the state. It was on its own. And there was kind of a payback time because it had long suppressed Shinto. I mean, it had not so much suppressed Shinto as it had controlled Shinto. Mm-hmm. So the Buddhist priests were also responsible very often for conducting services at Shinto shrines. So the Shinto priests themselves were very much second-class, religiously speaking, second-class citizens in Japan. But now they came back, and they came roaring back. And it was payback time for Buddhism having controlled Shinto. So all of the Buddhist artifacts in Shinto shrines were forced to physically taken out. And in some, there were some provinces. By this time, too, it's a little more complicated because in China, as we know, Buddhism was suppressed as early as 845. And then you have Neo-Confucianism. Well, I'll try to skip some of that. But anyway, coming back to Japan. There were provinces in Japan, especially in southern Japan, where every single Buddhist temple was burned down in the entire province. Wow. Every single. Yes. It was that severe. It wasn't that severe in many other places. But what happened in Japan was and is why did Buddhism survive that major suppression in 1868, early 1870s? It survived because of ancestor veneration. It survived because in Buddhist temples are the tablets of one's deceased ancestors. When you burn down the temple, you are also burning down the tablets of your ancestors. So Buddhism survived not because people were wanted to meditate and I said, "Oh, I won't have a place to meditate anymore." It survived because if you destroy Buddhist, some people call it ancestor worship. That's a misnomer. Japanese do not worship their ancestors, but they do venerate them, as the Chinese do. And that's, of course, Confucian custom. Buddhism in India ancestor veneration was not part of Indian Buddhism, became part of Buddhism thanks to its experience in China and Confucianism. All right. So what saved Buddhism was ancestor veneration. You cannot destroy my ancestors. And that's when, particularly on the Japan seacoast, the peasants rose up in revolt. They were willing to go to war to save their temples because that was saving their ancestors. And with that, the Meiji government at the time was very, very weak when it started in 1868. It had no methods of national taxation, etc. It had no money, income. It ended up having to borrow its income, its finances from the true Pure Land sects, which were quite wealthy. They lent the money to the Japanese government so that they bought. But they said, if you want our money, you will stop oppressing us. And that's how Buddhism survived. But what came out of that was, and we've seen it in the United States with minority peoples, and that is they become what? After they're suppressed, they have to prove they're with the game. They're supporting the country. And so as a result, Japanese Buddhists then became super patriots to prove that they might be a foreign religion, but they had the Japanese spirit. And of course, Zen was the easiest way to prove that because it had long been associated with the warrior class. And the warriors, as Japan decided not only to modernize, but it also learned from the West. Not only did it learn the industrial might of the West, but what made the West so powerful? That it had colonies, that it could, exploit the natural resources and the cheap labor of these colonies to develop its own wealth. So Japan said, we've got to do this too. 300 years they've been isolating themselves from the world, but now they say, look, if we want to be as powerful as the Western countries, their motto was to create, it was called Fukoku Kyohei, which means a wealthy country with a strong army. That strong army initially was to protect Japan from being colonized by the West. But then once that was clear that they would not become a colony, then the army was used to expand and create what was called the Japanese Empire. First fighting China in 1894-95 to take over Taiwan, and then fighting Russia in 1904-05 to take over Korea, right? And then expanded Manchuria, etc. So the point being is that the Buddhist leadership felt they had to demonstrate their loyalty to the country, and effectively they became super patriots. And for the ordinary Japanese, the thing that the ordinary soldier, the Pure Land, is waiting after death. For the Zen, for the officer corps, it is the non-self. You could empty the self and become completely at one with the state and one with the emperor and do his bidding selflessly.
Right. And so that's interesting because from what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that Zen wasn't co-opted necessarily to preserve the existence of the state. It was actually trying to prove its worth. So Buddhism, would you agree with Buddhism that? And the state became separate. Its usefulness.
Yes, its usefulness, absolutely. And as we see, and that's why what we're doing here with mindfulness is useful.
Yeah. It's instrumental. It's functional.
Things I'd like to bring up that are kind of astounding was just how much the principle of compassion was associated with war.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is just we think it's ridiculous to even think that way, but I mean, how did it come about that they could create that sort of association?
That's right. The human mind is nothing but, if not inventive. And you already mentioned it in one of your questions here, and that is this. It certainly has revolved around this, the Sutra of Skillful Means, or the Kaushalya Sutra. All right.
Right. That has been so abused, that sutra, and used for so many different nefarious purposes.
It's a surprising sutra in a way. But anyway, so briefly, here is the Buddha. Before he becomes a Buddha, he's still a bodhisattva at this time. So he's still a kind of a spiritual, sacred, a spiritual secular person. And he's a ship captain. Right? So, but he already, because he's on his way to becoming Buddha, one of his abilities is that he is able to read people's minds. And he looks on the members of the people on his ship, and he realizes there's a robber among them, and that the robber intends, as soon as people go to sleep, he's going not only to rob all the people on the ship, he's going to kill them too. So he's in a quandary. What am I going to do? And so he thinks to himself, well, all right, I could tell the other passengers, you've got a robber amongst you, and this is what he plans to do. But what would the passengers do? They would kill the robber. And what would happen to them? They would have to go. They would go to in a very long time to hell to pay for the karmic debt. So no, it's not fair to do that. All right. Well, but if I don't do anything, all these people will die. And so finally he decides, all right, I'll kill the robber. Now you would think that he was killing the robber because the robber was the bad guy and he wanted to save the good guys, the passengers. And that certainly was a part of it. But the interesting part of it is, and this is where the compassionate part comes, is that he killed the robber out of his compassion for the robber. Compassion for the robber. How could killing the robber be compassion for the robber? Because by killing the robber, he was preventing the robber from accruing to him all of the negative karma that would have come to him as a result of the robber killing all of these people on the ship. And he was saving the robber from interminable hell. And that was an act of compassion for the robber. And therefore, killing can become, from that, as if you want to interpolate from that sutra, killing can become an compassionate act because you are saving them from what would be an even worse fate if they had not been killed.
Right, but you do raise the point in the book, later in the book, that within the Theravada tradition, in their canonical text, there's absolutely no justification for killing.
Well, you would like to think so.
Am I wrong?
Yes. Remember what I said about the human mind? It is so inventful. So how do the Theravadins get around this problem? All right. True enough, as you said, Ron, there are no Theravada sutras that justify killing. All right. So you would think that would stop it. All right. But it didn't.
Yeah.
Why? And the first place we see that historically is in the Mahavamsa. Do you remember the Chronicles of Sri Lanka? Are either of you familiar with Mahavamsa? At any rate, we think today that this struggle between the Tamils and the Sri Lankans is kind of, we saw the civil war between the two, right? Recently,
Yeah.
in the last 20 years. And we kind of, there's a tendency to think that may be some kind of a new phenomenon, but it's a very, very old phenomenon. And I could go on to the whole length, but anyway, the Mahavamsa, the Tamils have invaded Sri Lanka in the Maha. This is, I don't want to, maybe in the 900s or the 1000s, but I would have to look back exactly what it dates to. But anyway, the point is, the Tamils have invaded. The Sri Lankans are launching a war against them to try to drive them out of Sri Lanka. They don't succeed, but they do succeed in killing multiple thousands of them. And there is this Sri Lankan king, his name is Dutagamini. He is worried at the end of this killing, something like King Ashoka in a sense. He's worried that he has broken the Buddhist vows not to kill. Right? Mm-hmm. So he has some monks who are here, and he approaches them. He says, I'm worried because I've killed all of these people, and I know I'm going to have some karmic consequences for all of this. But the monk said, no, sire, don't worry about it, because you see, all those people that you killed weren't Buddhists. There was only one person who had only taken the lay precepts. So you effectively have killed no one. At most, you killed half a person. So by reading these people out of Buddhism, you denied them their humanity.
Wow.
Now, more recently, you saw that in Thailand. There was a communist insurgency, right? And the question is, should Buddhists fight against the communists and kill the communists? And one of the leading monks they have a very hierarchical system there. But one of the monk leaders said, there is no problem. When you kill communists, they are not people. The demons. They are demonic people. And you should consider, when you kill one of these demonic people, it's like making an offering of fish to the Buddha. So at any rate, in Theravada then, if you deny, you can't kill a human being, you can't kill another Buddhist, you can't kill a real person, but if you deny their personhood, then you are good. And then finally, it's interesting, today we have a Buddhist chaplaincy in the U.S. military. All right? And we know, too, that in Buddhism, a great deal is made in Buddhism about the attitude the attitude you have in whatever action you are doing, your motivation.
Your intention.
Your motivation, right.
And so there is today in the U.S. military, there is a former Thai monk who is now a military. He had to disrobe. Let's say this. He had to disrobe to become a U.S. Army military chaplain. All right. The question was, can a Buddhist kill? And he said, of course they can kill. Why? Because they have to. If there is no freedom in your country to practice Buddhism, then Buddhism would die. So you have to fight for your country so that Buddhism can survive. And then he also went on to say that in Buddhism, intentionality is a key factor. So if you are a Buddhist soldier and you go to the battlefield thinking the enemy is evil, and that you have an anger with them and you kill them, that's wrong. But if you go to the battlefield and you say, this is simply my duty, I'm fulfilling my duty to my country to protect Buddhism. I have no anger against the person I'm going to kill, but I consider this to be fulfilling my duty, then that's quite acceptable for a Buddhist soldier to kill. Now, what's even more interesting, today the Dalai Lama has this picture of being the true Buddhist, truly dedicated to peace because he doesn't want to fight the Chinese. He doesn't want to kill the Chinese. He just wants to, for them to realize the mistake they've done. So on. Yeah. But he was also and there's it's still on the YouTube, and it's called ST Circus. Have you ever heard of ST Circus? Yeah, please say it. No. But anyway, ST Circus, very quickly again, I tried to quickly. There was as you may know, the Tibetans rose up in the 50s and the 60s and conducted guerrilla warfare against the Chinese. And he was very much involved in that. But he was asked by this, ST Circus, by the way, was the CIA. The Dalai Lama was on the CIA payroll. He was paid by the CIA. And there are checks. They actually, the German television station went back. They actually have the checks showing his pay from the CIA. At any rate, he was asked in the ST Circus was the CIA's name, the covert name for their support for Tibetan guerrillas fighting the Chinese late 50s and 60s. Mm. Right. So the BBC announcer goes to the Dalai Lama and says, "Well, I understand you were involved in this, and I thought Buddhism was this religion of peace." And the Dalai said, "This is a quote." Essentially, you can go to and look on YouTube, but it's a pretty accurate quote, and that is, he said, "Oh, you have to understand, in Buddhism, if you have a good goal in mind, and if you have good intentions, then even if someone is killed in the process, that's acceptable. All right? If you have a good goal and good intentions, if someone is killed, not a problem." And that's the Dalai Lama himself. So he was justifying his support for the Tibetan guerrillas during that period. But what's really important, at the end, the CIA withdraws its support from his troops, basically. And the reason it does is because of Nixon's trip to China, and the Chinese said, "We will reestablish relations, but one of our conditions is you must stop the CIA support for the guerrillas in Tibet." And they did. All right. Then what happens is that the guerrillas, Tibetan guerrillas, are actually in Nepal. They couldn't have a base in Tibet. They were too weak. They were in Nepal at a place called Mustang. Actually, was the name of their base. So the Dalai Lama sends a voice recording, a tape recording, to them. And he says in the tape recording, he says, "I want to thank you for all that you've done for the Tibetan people," and it was and so forth. He said, "But now we're living in a new era, and in this era, we have to wage our battle by peaceful means." And that's when he became the messenger of peace. But it was only his war and his peace were only tactics. He had no problem with Buddhism being involved in killing as many Chinese as they could possibly kill. Yes.
Well, that's interesting too, because that there's another case where the state, Buddhism is the state religion. So that's a common pattern that we're seeing through all of this.
Of course.
Is when Buddhism is state supported or gets too cozy to politics, a lot of trouble happens.
Yes. And
I'd like to go back to just a few things, and I don't think we can. I don't think we could end this interview. We're not quite ready to end, but without that famous quote from D.T. Suzuki about being one with the sword.
Yes.
If you recall that, I think it's on page 110.
Would you mind reading it instead of just? You have it in front of you?
Okay. I think I have the right one. The sword is generally associated with killing, and most of us wonder how it can come into connection with Zen, which is a school of Buddhism teaching the gospel of love and mercy. The fact is that the art of swordsmanship distinguishes between the sword that kills and the sword that gives life. The one that is used by a technician cannot go any further than killing, for he never appeals to the sword unless he intends to kill. The case is altogether different with the one who is compelled to lift the sword. For it is really not he, but the sword itself that does the killing. He had no desire to harm anybody, but the enemy appears and makes himself a victim. It is though the sword performs automatically its function of justice, which is the function of mercy. When the sword is expected to play this sort of role in human life, it is no more a weapon of self-defense or an instrument of killing, and the swordman turns into an artist of the first grade, engaged in producing a work of genuine originality.
Wow.
Right.
There's some interesting revisionist work there.
Well, of course, what does it accomplish? That it takes out any responsibility of the individual for their actions.
Yep.
It turns it over to, in this case, to the sword. And let me tell you a little, what I felt interesting story. After when I was writing my book, I wrote most of the book at Hanazono University, which, as you may know, is if Komazawa is the university of the Soto Zen sect, Hanazono is much smaller, but it's a university of the Rinzai Zen sect. All right, and the head of that Hanazono University is a Rinzai master by the name of Kono Taitsu. All right. Now, when I first came to start writing the book, I met Kono Taitsu. They have an international Zen institute at Hanazono University. So they were the place. They have a library of very helpful people. It was a wonderful experience in that way. At any rate, when I began writing my book, he knew what I was doing, and he called me into his office, and he said, "I want to know." He said, "I want to know that I'm supporting you in what you're doing." He said, "Because I myself have tried to to have the Rinzai Zen sect reflect on its wartime support for Japanese militarism." He said, but I had no success. So I'm hoping that maybe you, as a foreigner, because as you know, the Japanese people are very susceptible to outside criticism. Unless they're criticized from the outside, it's very difficult for them to change. So if you, as a foreigner, say the things that I've been saying and been trying to say, maybe you will get an audience in Japan, and maybe things will change. So I was really encouraged by that, and by him as well. All right. So I wrote my book, and I read, of course, that passage about the sword, and so I had an exit interview with him too. I finished the book, etc., and he said, "Well, I'm certainly hopeful that it will have an impact," which it did, because eventually the Myoshinji, which is the largest subsect of the Rinzai sect, they did offer a war apology, and they did it mentioning my book as one of the catalysts for that war apology. But at any rate, I went into his office to have the exit interview, and I said, "I know how you feel about the war, and the support you've given me, and I very much appreciate it. Isn't it time for someone in your position, both as a Zen master and as the president of the university, to make a very clear statement that Zen and the sword are not one? That in fact, the use of the idea that the sword can become this kind of automated object of justice and mercy, we can see is, I suppose, a degenerate form or a corrupted form of the Zen message."
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And what was what was his reply? His reply was, "See, you're a foreigner, and you just don't understand that for we Japanese, the sword is a holy object. We cannot disavow it." And I thought, this is from the man, who was supposed to Rinzai support for the, and even at the last, when push came to shove, he couldn't disavow the unity of Zen and the sword.
Wow.
And if he couldn't, who else was there?
Wow. Yeah. It seems like that a lot of the appeal of the sword, I mean, in the writings, was the appeal to emptiness, selflessness and emptiness. Was that part of the draw of the kamikaze?
Yes.
So how did that play out, this idea of emptiness and their sacrifice?
Well, I think we know theoretically emptiness has no nationality, no state. Theoretically.
It should.
But in reality, what, you're asking a young person to die. Right? And what you're, and this is true, I think, for any soldier certainly in the modern period. You're really asking them to die for, quote unquote, the state. Where is the state? I mean, countries have borders and things, but really, you're asking them, if you really are honest about it, you're asking them to die for a particular political policy of a particular person or persons, right? And they call that the state. So Buddhism was very helpful, especially Zen Buddhism was very helpful to kamikaze. You have young men who have their whole life to look for. Their whole life is in front of them. And you're asking them to go off and become a human bomb with no possibility that they're going to live through it. So how do you do that? Well, if you were, in that Pure Land sect, you're going to be reborn in the Pure Land. But if you're in the Zen part, you empty this, you say to yourself is ultimately empty. There's no, you have a personality and, relative truth. Yes, you are here. But ultimately, you are empty because there's nothing ultimately unchanging in you. We all know the story. But if you can accept that, you can overcome at least to some degree, they were scared. All right. And in fact, anyway, they were scared. But to some degree, you can say, I can, and remember in the book, this Lieutenant Colonel Sugimoto Goro claims that Zen should be the basis of the entire imperial military. And that book, over 100,000 copies of that book, and it's placed in every high school in Japan. And the students are then, this is what true loyalty is about. Because why does Sugimoto Goro say that Zen is so important? He said, because I can empty the self and become one with
the state.
No, one with the emperor. And this is why Zen is the basis of the imperial military. And so that was carried over to the kamikaze pilots. I can empty the self and become one with the state. And remember, we have to remember who were the first kamikaze? Do you remember who the first kamikaze were? The first kamikaze were when Japan in the mid 1200s was invaded twice by the Mongols. All right, and the Mongols, being the fools, the great warriors that they were, they conquered Korea first. Then they told the Koreans, we're going to conquer Japan next. The Koreans said, well, don't go now because this is typhoon season. And the Mongols said, we're in charge. We will go when we goddamn well pleased to go. Buddha well pleased. They were Buddhists, by the way. So one of the real first Buddhists, they were Tibetan Buddhists, see. Anyway, they told them, we'll go when we go. And each time they went, there was a typhoon, and it destroyed them. And so kami is the Japanese word for a Shinto deity, and kaze is for wind. So a divine wind. So they believed, these pilots were convinced that this time they would become the modern equivalent of the typhoons that had saved Japan.
Oh, jeez. Wow.
And that was how another way to justify. But anyway, they emptied themselves. They emptied their individual self to become one with the state, the universal self. But it wasn't really the universal self, of course. It was the self of the state.
Yep. Wow.
But that's Buddhism can be used that way, so easily. It convinced that the selflessness is, you overcome selflessness by becoming one with this larger entity, and that's genuine Buddhist selflessness.
What a conflation!
It is.
Yeah, and so it didn't, even after the war, and this is another chapter in your book, chapter 11, Corporate Zen, in the post-war period. And as you know, I really enjoyed that chapter immensely.
It's certainly connected to what you folks are doing.
Yes, because of the contemporary corporate mindfulness movement that's happening, teaching mindfulness corporations. And so can you say a little bit about what happened there right after the war? These monasteries became training centers for Japanese corporations, right? They sent their management, senior staff.
Well, not so much senior. Really, it was really not senior, but they're newly hired employees. They were the ones who went. Yeah. In general, there were things for senior staff, but it was really educated. You see, one of the reasons that the samurai had been attracted to Zen is because it is very Spartan and very disciplined and very frugal. All right. And so you can imagine if you got this young kid just out of college, full of himself or herself, and used to the soft life, right? And you want to toughen them up. So there were two places where they could send their newly hired employees. One is that the Japanese military was then after the war called the Self-Defense Forces. It still is called that. They had a program for short-term military training, and the corporation would either send, sometimes both. They would send their new hires for this military training under the Self-Defense Force, or they would send them to Zen temples, right, to get toughened up. You get up at 3:30 in the morning, and you move about, you get whacked. You're eating rice gruel, right? No time to think, no time to sleep. You're out, if you're out in the garden working all day, the mountains working all day. It is a full jam-packed schedule in which discipline. You're sleeping on a single straw tatami mat. That's it. Right? It's your heaven and your hell. Right? And so it is an excellent place to toughen up new employees. Plus, the added benefit is that you understand what selflessness is. This time you're not selfless to get in a plane and crash yourself against a ship, or for the state.
It's for the corporation.
It's for the...
Right. Yeah, that's a fascinating parallel, I think.
What more could you ask for if you were a corporate head? Send these folks to the Zen. But as you mentioned, and I think this is a very important point, there was at least one Zen master, this Katsuhira Sotetsu, who himself had been a kamikaze pilot, right? And he would have died if the war hadn't ended. But you remember what happened. You remember that, Ron. Go ahead and tell the story.
Well, he started to be a critic. Started criticizing what was going on, and
why? Was he a critic?
I recall. Well, I think he was guilt-ridden, reflecting back.
Because he saw that it was the same mindset that had led all these young people, including himself, he would have died without a question. And that the same mindset was now propelling Zen to serve corporate needs instead of state needs. And what did he do, Ron, at the end when he realized this? First of all, he wrote a book. His book is called The Enlightenment. We have to remember here, too, there are Japanese pickles. And the way you make a pickle is you put it whatever, for example, the cucumbers. You put the cucumbers in a salty brine. You put a heavy lid on the top of that, and you have to put a big stone on top of the lid in order that slowly that weights down, and the cucumbers turn into pickles as the salt works into them. All right. So he wrote a book that called The Enlightenment of a Pickle Pressing Stone, which is, of course, impossible. But what was that really mean? That you put these young newly hires into what? The pressure cooker of Zen training. Right? And they come out picklified, which in this case, corporatized.
Yep.
Picklified.
Corporatized. All right? And what did he, after he wrote that book, and he said, this is what happened during the war, and this is what's happening to Zen in peacetime. Right? After he wrote that book, right, and I know this for a fact because you may have heard of Jeff Shore, but he's a very long time Zen practitioner in the Rinzai. At any rate, they have a session. Jeff is there at the session. At the end of the session, they go to open the door to his private room. They don't hear a sound. No, there's no response. They open the sliding doors, and there he is. He's hung himself. Now, do we know exactly why he hung himself? No, but it's very easy to understand. He was so distraught, I believe, especially when you read his book, you understand this. So distraught to have seen that Zen, in a sense, hadn't changed. Its internal mechanism hadn't changed. It was just who you were becoming selfless for the state or for the corporation. And if we realize the full import of that, how could I be a part? How can I do it? Yep. How can I do it all over again?
Wow.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's a couple more points that I think we can talk about before we wrap up. Is this whole idea of what you call samadhi power?
That's right. Yep.
And that's a recent paper,
yes.
Right? That you are presenting here in San Francisco, or talking about?
I'm talking. Well, yes, I'm going to be talking about that at the San Francisco Zen Center. That's right. And I don't know. Does anyone talk about samadhi power in the mindfulness movement in the U.S.? Is this a new term?
No. It's not a new term for me, but it's not used.
Used in the mindfulness discourse. No. I suppose it's probably not. One reason it's not is because it would smack of a religion of Buddhism. It would. Right. And I think the mindfulness movement, and correct me if I'm wrong, is they kind of offhandedly acknowledge their debt to Buddhism, but they're really trying to turn it into a secular pursuit so that no one could say, well, I don't want to do, I'm a Catholic, so I don't do Buddhist stuff or whatever.
It's a rhetorical strategy.
Am I correct in assuming mindfulness in a sense is the second generation that yoga started the first generation. Have you thought of it this way? That yoga was the first generation of secularizing Asian religious practice. Mm-hmm. So people would imagine that this practice really is not a religious practice at all.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's been a lot of parallels about that.
When there was a debate in the YMCA as to whether they should allow yoga to be practiced in a Christian institution. And so, to me, mindfulness is kind of like the second generation of that. You have to strip it of its religious background in order to make it acceptable in a secular, to neutralize it,
Yes.
to religionize it, to make it acceptable. So I think I'm not surprised to hear you say that samadhi as a term or samadhi power has not been promoted within the American mindfulness movement. But
Right.
Nevertheless, it is still it certainly has been, it was recognized in warrior Japan and Suzuki writes about it, about how Japanese warrior leaders, the samurai, the elite, how they practice Zen in order to acquire that power. And as we've seen in my book, how that the acquisition of that power continued to be an important motivational tool for the Zen practice during the war. And so what we were talking about is the power that comes from a concentrated state of mind, the mental power that derived from a concentrated state of mind. And that's
right.
That's
and that can be directed for different purposes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because in part it's severed from ethics.
Yes,
It's
it's
a pure
completely
state.
separate from any ethics at all. And of course, even if it weren't, I wish you could say, well, if you would just join Buddhist ethics to this. But if your Buddhist ethics claims that killing people is a compassionate act, restoring Buddhist ethics isn't going to help much either.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
And I think that's why, warrior mind training. I'm not certain where that's at these days in the military. I know that they tried it. I'm not certain if it's been incorporated into the military training yet or not. But it's certainly. Yes.
Ron discovered some of that, and we discovered also that it disappeared recently, right? Ron,
all right. Okay, so then that's why I don't.
Well, at least the Training Institute, mindfulness, MMFT, mindfulness fitness training, or whatever it was being run out of some institute. Elizabeth Stanley, who used to be actually a military officer, an Army intelligence officer, I think.
Yeah.
And then suddenly her website just disappeared mysteriously. Nobody knows what happened. But that was definitely an effort to train the U.S. military in mindfulness techniques even before they went into Iran and Afghanistan, pre-deployment training. Well, maybe we should thank you for this great interview. I mean, I learned so much. Unbelievable, these nuanced insights that came up during this interview. Well, Brian, I look forward to seeing you in San Francisco in a few weeks.
Absolutely. So do I.
Yeah, I wish I could be there.
I wish David, maybe I'll get to New York one of these days.
That would be good, please.
Look me up. My only problem, I love to travel. My only problem is getting somebody else to pay for it.
Yeah, that's our problem too.
That's right.
Okay.
All right. Take care. You have been listening to Brian Victoria, author of Zen at War. Brian's major writings have focused on the relationship of not only Buddhism but religion in general to violence and warfare. He holds a master's degree in Buddhist studies from the Soto Zen sect-affiliated Komazawa University in Tokyo and a PhD from the Department of Religious Studies at Temple University. From 2005 to 2013, Brian was a professor of Japanese studies and director of the AEA Japan and its Buddhist Traditions program at Antioch University in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Currently, he is a visiting research fellow at the International Research Center for Japanese Studies in Kyoto, Japan, where he is writing a book tentatively entitled Zen Terrorism in the 1930s Japan. Brian is a fully ordained Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen sect. You can find links to the book Zen at War, as well as additional articles by Brian on our website, mindfulcranks.com. Thanks for listening.